Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This project has received funding from the European Union and Carleton University. The views expressed in this video do not reflect those of the European Union or the Center for European Studies.
We remember what was going on when Mr. Medvedev was the president, Russian proposal of having a European security treaty. We've got into the situation which I call Russia and the rest. Russia proposed something which was universally rejected by the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe said that we are happy with the European security order being based on NATO and OSCE. Moscow was not happy about that. The proposal has been buried. That's a problem. And too little was happening elsewhere. I happened to be in Brussels when I remember the Mali thing was only starting, and Mr. Lavrov was there. And the Europeans very much wanted to have him on board because they knew that it would not be controversial for Russia. And Mr. Lavrov said, we're just not interested. This is not our problem, frankly. Why do we need to help you out with Mali? And I mean, that was quite a disappointment for some people in Brussels who were still seeing Russia as a security partner. Remember, common space in external security was still the official goal of the policy. That was just 2.5 years back. Syria case, lack of cooperation was the rule. Libya case, when Russia, didn't cooperate, but at least it kind of didn't veto the whole thing in the United Nations, and it was an exception. So the confidence was lost, the momentum was lost, there was no chemistry with most leaders, there were a number of bilateral relations which worked differently. So altogether, this was a basket case already. But that's where I'm only starting, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, because this is the surface. This is where you see that it didn't work. The more serious things were kind of underlying processes. One of them was that, a fundamental reassessment in Russia whether it would want to view this kind of European Union as a role model. By the way, people in Russia are absolutely unhappy with Europe's tendency to appropriate, with EU tendency to appropriate the notion of Europe. Russians also believe that Russia is Europe, but it's just a different Europe. It's an alternative Europe. And this is a very quick thing where you can see the discrepancy, the difference between what Russia wants for itself and its own future and what it sees in today's Europe. And I put here kind of 4 things. I could have come with more, but these are very important. Europe is decadent. It's losing traditional values, Russia believes, when it wants itself to be a champion of conservative values, of Christian values, essentially of Europe of the motherlands, Europe of fatherlands, Europe of the 19th century. So it doesn't work here. Moscow does not believe that European countries are sovereign. Frankly speaking, with due respect, in Moscow there is a belief that there are only 3 fully sovereign countries in the world. It's the US, China, and Russia. And depending on who is visiting Moscow, he or she may hear other things said, but this is what is really fundamental here. So none of the EU countries is believed to be fully sovereign, either because US through NATO dictates their security policy, or because they've already given up huge parts of their sovereignty within the EU, but this is why they are not sovereign. And Russia is fully sovereign and wants to remain fully sovereign. So the concept of pooling sovereignties does not fly there. There's no understanding that you can pool sovereignty. You can only give up sovereignty. Europe is in economic decline. Now you can argue differently, but for many, many years when Europe was demonstrating very sluggish growth, if any, Russia was growing at an average pace of 7% a year between 2003 and 2007. And that was the thing which could not be easily dismissed. And Europe was in economic decline because it was overregulated, because it was anti-liberal, actually, from a certain standpoint of view. So Russia didn't want to be part of that economic mechanism, but rather wanted to be part of growing Asia-Pacific. And as I've already mentioned, Europe not a foreign policy or security policy actor, and Russia is. It's the center of the own geopolitical project, which it wants to promote, and a global power, at least in its dreams. So when Mr. Obama, President Obama, says that Russia is a regional power, That irritates a lot of people back in Russia because they think this is a wrong description. Not only that this is an unfair description, but this is what they think again. And another thing was this. There was this perceived weakness. No, 5 still. I have my, sorry. I don't mind if there will be no questions. I'm quoting Mr. Karaganov here, a famous Russian foreign policy analyst, and this is the embodiment of the thinking. The West that Russia now faces is not the self-confident alliance that proclaimed itself victor of the Cold War. It is a directionless gaggle, beset with economic insecurities and losing sight of its moral convictions. This is very, very important. Now, some people in the United States argue, how come that Russia says that the West is weak, and at the same time it says that the West is a security challenge? I mean, this is a valid question, but I think I cannot answer the one. But this, I think, is very important, and it drives the policy. So, since I don't have time to go through this slide, you just have to bear with me that I have very, very detailed explanations of how this perception emerged. And only against that background, Ukraine enters. So all that, I have not yet mentioned the word Ukraine once. Ukraine is a symptom and a driver of the crisis, but Ukraine is not the source. Ukraine is not, it's not the primary reason for the crisis. And again, I'm quoting another famous Russian analyst who says here that one good thing about the Ukraine crisis is that at least now everyone can stop pretending. Russia can stop pretending that it is part of Europe, and Europe can stop pretending it agrees. So I cannot agree more with that. The thinking that Russia is dealing with the weak West, especially Europe, and also with Ukraine, which is on the verge of collapse altogether, that's what's driving the conflict. And the fact that Ukraine did not collapse but experienced patriotic mobilization, and the fact that there is an unprecedented EU solidarity, unexpected EU solidarity on the issue, did not change anything really. Because Kremlin has not given up, does not want to give up, will not give up. Because this is how it doesn't see, this is not how it sees the situation. It comes forward with counter-sanctions, and it comes forward with the use of force. And then the original calculus is restored, that sooner or later, if you press hard, if you have resolve, if you have political will, if you have skills, and if you use all of that, it doesn't matter that you may have less resources. What matters is how you use the resources. And Moscow has been successful. Moscow has been successful. Minsk II is a colossally less advantageous for Ukraine than Minsk I was. And we've all agreed to Minsk II. Ukraine is not going to implement Minsk II because certain things which are inscribed in that document are such that only a country that has already militarily capitulated, signed unconditional surrender, could implement. The constitutional changes, the way they are inscribed into that document. I don't know why it was signed. It's unfortunate. It's because there is no confidence and that everybody's cheating. Because there's no way for Ukraine to implement that agreement. So we're up for troubles in future as well. Now it's really the last minute. And the last minute is slide A. Just if you still think it's a strategic partnership. Look at the figures, especially kind of this penultimate row, inimical. For a Russian, the word enemy is a very strong word. You really don't mix up. You don't use it as a synonym for adversary. Enemy is enemy. So when 24% of the Russians in January this year say that the EU is an enemy, maybe we should stop talking about strategic partnership, at least for a change. There was 1% a year before, and even 1% was enough. And I have figures not on me here about the Germany, specific attitudes to Germany. We've been proud of the Russian and happy about the Russian-German historic reconciliation. I would not say that it has all gone, but pretty much big chunks of it have. Because again, it's up to 20% of the Russians who now consider Germany an enemy. I would not have been able to predict it several years back. So the relations are bad. And this is not just a sign of, that Moscow uses effective propaganda. There's more than that. And just another slide, basically the same idea. Look at that. 79% of the Russians, September last year, consider the Western countries. Yes, there might be a difference in attitudes towards the United States and Europe, but 79% believe that the Western countries are Russia's adversaries, that intend to solve own problems at Russia's expense and, whenever possible, damage Russia's interests. We're talking about strategic partnership. So these are my conclusions. I have only two scenarios, and they're both bad. One is that, of course, we're not going to have a Cold War. They are short to medium term, yes. I'm not looking beyond the horizon. We're not going to have a new Cold War. We have economic relationship, but we would have, under that scenario, a deep conflict nevertheless, and everything is hinged on the Ukrainian crisis. If there is a new wave of escalation of the crisis in Ukraine, which is possible, there will be a new round of sanctions, and we will be just going down, and it will be a downward spiral. What is a good scenario? Well, if there is a certain acceptable solution, not just freezing, a solution of the crisis in Ukraine, then the economic pragmatism will probably prevail, but we will still not go back to the business as usual for three reasons. I mean, our level of ambitions, our level of aspirations will be lower than before for three reasons. First, all those old trends which are described 15 minutes back, they're still all there. So you take Ukraine out, you still will have to deal with all those things. Second, the economic crisis in Russia, which objectively lowers the economic interest and the possibilities for economics-based lobbyism in Europe. I live in Finland. Again, I know what I'm talking about. This is the country which wants to have the best possible economic relations with Russia. If you now talk with the business people, you will not recognize the same people as compared with even 9 months ago, let alone a year and a half ago. And the third thing is that same lack of trust. So I believe the strategic partnership for real is dead. It has to be buried. It will not be resumed, in my view, anytime soon under any circumstances. But the formula, it's so nice that it might still be used, first of all, to describe the long-term goal of the relationship. Because there is nothing wrong about dreaming, daydreaming, thinking about the Russia-EU relations once again as the relationship of strategic partnership. I would certainly not mind to have it. I just don't know when and how that's going to happen. And in that sense, I will probably keep the word strategic partnership in my own vocabulary. Or just it will be used because it's a good figure of speech.
As a reality. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation. It was the first visit to Ottawa and Canada at all, and I hope that it's not the last one. So my presentation will concern the EU-Russia partnership, and I would like to start with some common definitions. What is this tool of strategic partnership? I would like to introduce my vision very shortly. Traditionally, European Union developed the relation with third countries according to two main dimensions, two main approaches. The first one is the equal partnership. The second one is the junior partnership. Equal partnership, it's this partnership where with the most developed countries. And as for the junior partnership, it's characterized by certain algorithms, certain tools which are approved by the European Union side, which are proposed to the partners. It's a case of Eastern Partnership, European Neighborhood Policy, Union for Mediterranean, etc. As for the strategic partnership, this is a kind of equal partnership with, which is developed for developing countries such as United States, Canada, Japan, Russia, etc. As we can see, among two strategic partners of European Union, all of them are quite different, and European Union has different grounds to establish strategic partners with all of these countries, as it was mentioned today. And that is why strategic partnership has now its common nature for every countries, and it could not be considered as a universal tool which is applicable for all countries. And in this sense, it is desirable to distinguish a strategic partnership in terms of the certain countries, because strategic partnership with United States is absolutely different than strategic partnership with China or with Brazil or with Russia. In my presentation, I will talk about EU-Russia partnership, and I would like to show some figures, maybe which is known for you. European Union is the largest trade partner of Russia. From European Union side, Russia is a third trade partner after United States and China. EU-Russia border is the longest land border between EU and its neighbors. It's about 1/4, 1/3. And the certain concerning the visa policy, Russian citizens received 43% of all Schengen visa issued in 2013, and only 36 in 2014. That's very new figures. At the beginning of our relations, Russia was considered as partners, but such relation was developed in the framework of so-called junior partnership. And at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, EU-Russia relation came to the next stage, and it was announced a new definition, the strategic partnership, which became a new agenda of EU-Russia relation. Looking back to the history of EU-Russia relation, we can distinguish the following reasons why Russia is considered by European Union as a strategic partner and vice versa. First point is geographical proximity, common borders, high level of people-to-people contacts, which are very important. The second point, it's interdependence of economies. Russia is the main supplier of natural resources. European Union is the main supplier of technologies and customers goods. Third point is close historical, cultural, and personal relations, common heritage, and so on. And final, common participation of Russia and European Union as a global actors in the settlement of the regional conflicts. Now, Russia and the European Union could be considered as very important, but from the other side, very difficult partners. From one hand, the mutual cooperation is vital for each of partner. From the other hand, there are a lot of misunderstanding and contradictions between the parties, and that is why, of course, our relations have some trouble, some peculiarities incomparable with other EU strategic partnerships. As for the institutional structure, we can distinguish. We can distinguish following documents which was the basis for this strategic partnership. First one is a partnership and cooperation agreement, which was mentioned by Arkady, which was included in 1994. This is a model agreement which was presented by European Union to all Eastern partners. The second, it's common roadmaps on creation of common spaces, which were agreed in 2005, and which concerned for common spaces, common space of freedom, common space of economic space, common space of freedom, security, and justice, common space of external security, and common space of research and education. Now it's could be considered as a basic document, not legal documents, but it's so-called Soft Law Act, which regulates relations within 4 different dimensions. Common space, it's creation of integrated economy, integrated and open market, and in far future maybe creation of free trade association, free trade agreement. The second roadmap, it's a common space of freedom, security, and justice, which is divided in 3 directions: freedom, visa policy, immigration, security, as cooperation fighting illegal activities, and justice, judicial cooperation, and in criminal and civil matters. The third space, common space on external security. This space concerns the settlement of different world and regional conflicts. And final, the fourth space is a common space of research and education, which has the main objective to capitalize the Russian and European Union intellectual heritage, and to work together in the field of research and education. It must be noted that adoption of the roadmaps is a unique example of European Union external policy, because with no other countries such roadmaps were agreed. The system, the aim of such those roadmaps is to identify certain interests, certain actions which have to be done in by means of different legal acts, by means of international agreement. And in this sense, we can consider the common space roadmaps on common space as a framework decision, which have no legal power, which is a soft law act. Historically, it was considered that common space roadmaps should be transformed in the new agreement on strategic partnership, discussion of which was begun in 2006 and 2008. It was a beginning of the negotiation, but shortly, because after the beginning, it was stopped because of the Russian-Polish dispute on the meat bans. Later, it was stopped because of the Georgian conflict. At the moment, it is stopped because of the Ukrainian conflict. And now we are going to the current stage of our cooperation, which is after the Ukrainian crisis. In the beginning of 2014, Ukraine crisis seriously affected EU-Russia relations. The question arose: are European Union and Russia still strategic partners? According to the statement on Ukraine, in March 2014, the head of the state of the European Union have decided to suspend any bilateral talks on EU strategic partnership agreement, as well as the talks on the visa liberalization process. So, in general words, European Council decided to suspend EU-Russia contacts and to freeze any common project. The freezing of the relation did not mean the cancellation of the common project. European Union and Russia remain to be an important partners, but with a certain degree of misunderstanding, mistrust, and mutual condemnation. European Union unilaterally froze the development of relation, but did not cancel the existing projects. Moreover, starting from the March 2014, European Union imposed a series of sanctions, which could be divided in three main kinds. The first one is individual sanctions. The second one, sanctions against Crimea and Sevastopol. And the third sanctions, which were introduced in July 2014, it's economic anti-Russian sanctions. From the Russian side, Russian government in August 2014 imposed food embargo on, in terms of all European Union countries and all countries which imposed anti-Russian sanctions. It's Canada, United States, Japan, Australia. At the moment, Ukraine crisis have largely been dependent on the EU-Russia relation. Contradictions on the Ukraine crisis prevent the realization of common projects within EU-Russia strategic partnership, which are subjects of common interest. From the other hand, European Union and Russia are not ready to give up their strategic partnership. From the European Union side, it is some sort of idea that we want to punish Russia to harm its economy, but we don't want to cancel our project, our contacts with Russia. In these terms, the strategic partnership from European side could be considered as a forced strategic partnership. From Russian side, the situation is different. Russia is ready to restore business as usual, but Russia doesn't want to ask for cancellation of the sanctions, and Russia doesn't want to be first in the resumptions of the relations. At the moment, after 1 year of silence, Russia and the European Union, it seems to me that are trying to find a solution for this situation. In January, in January 2015, during the preparation of the European Council, the European External Action Service prepared the issue paper on the relations with Russia. It was the first document which demonstrated the willingness of the European Union to restore their relations. And this document, European External Service, defined the main interests in Russia in terms of European Union and vice versa. European External Office proposed to defer the Crimea sanctions and economic sanctions, sanctions which related to the situation in East Ukraine. And European External Action proposed some measures to gradually restore their relation. Unfortunately, there is no final decision concerning this document. Moreover, some days later, after the attack in Mariupol, the discussion of this document was stopped. And at the moment, in the European Union, there is no common idea how to restore the relation. There are different positions concerning this issue. And it was demonstrated during the last summits of European Council and Council of Foreign Ministers. From the Russian side, there is no any official documents concerning the resumption of the EU relations, but nevertheless, Russia is willing to restore it. To be honest, nonetheless, even without formal contacts, even without EU-Russia summit in wider sense, Russia and the European Union continue to consider each other as important and necessary partner. That is why we can conclude that there is a strategic partnership, and it is alive. Then it is dead. But this strategic partnership in the frozen state. To be honest, in the short-term perspective, there is no any perspective how there isn't enough grounds to fully restore the EU-Russia partnership. From the one side, the European Union wants to punish Russia, to impose some difficulties. From another side, Russia wants to split the unity of European Union. So it's some kind of the Cold War between two actors, between two partners. But how to solve its problem, how to solve this situation, this problem, there is no idea. But from my point of view, irrespective of political disagreement on Ukraine crisis, first of all, we can identify the common subject, common issues, which are subject of common interests, and to continue the discussion of these questions. The second thing is for the Ukrainian crisis. We have great disadvantages, a great disagreement concerning this issue, but nonetheless, even in this issue, we can identify certain questions which have a common interest, and it was demonstrated during the last Minsk II agreement, when European Union leaders, France and Germany, together with Russian leaders, reached an agreement concerning the resettlement of situation. So I think that, and I hope that there is some ways to for resumption of our relations, but it's a case of long-term perspective. Thank you very much.
In terms of Arkady's presentation, I think the question that jumps out of my mind is what caused this shift in the Russian approach. That assuming that there was a gradual shift that went on, that moved this potential partnership to a non-partnership, that it requires some examination of what caused that shift. And one explanation would be that it was fully explicable by internal Russian domestic factors. But I think one has to at least entertain the possibility that it was in part reactive to Western policy in combination with internal factors. Following that line, it leads me to reflect on the nature of the strategic partnership, also in light of what we've looked at in other partnerships. There are a couple of things that are really unique about this strategic partnership, and I'll just mention two of them. One of them is, of course, this is the only European partner. And I think what this has meant, I mean, my hypothesis would be that there's a certain baggage that enters because of this. That whereas the EU deals with European partners differently than with non-European partners, and this is because presuming that Russia is a European country, which they both seem to agree upon for different reasons, that therefore the validity of European norms and values and the assumption that Russia should move to be acting like a European country as the EU understands it is present in that case, but not in the case of the other strategic partners. I mean, the common values with Canada and the US aren't really contested, so it's not an issue. When you talk about China, we didn't hear too much about norms and values in our talks this morning. With Japan, it's not an issue, but when we think about some of the other countries that don't have the same common normative basis, or at least it might or might not, it becomes a problematic issue. So I think that sets it off. The second thing that sets it off from the other strategic partners, of course, is that it's a neighbor. It's the only strategic partner that is geographically contiguous with the EU, and therefore it has a shared neighborhood, which opens up the possibility of conflict, particularly in the context of the first factor I mentioned. Now, taking those two things into account, then one might ask, what's the basis of the partnership? I mean, Vadim gave us his view, which are some of the problematic factors too. And I would say, well, let's look at three things that have come up in the course of our discussion. Common economic interests, clearly present. I mean, that's the predominant one, and I think the driving one. Second, values, which is problematic. And third, which is entering the strategic partnerships. Well, we could just say a third factor would be what are the other things that are important to these partners that they might share or not share. And the first one that comes to my mind is security issues. That both Russia and Europe are very concerned about security issues. Europe, the whole raison d'etre of European integration, to prevent another war. It's a security consideration. A very important part of that, of course, the post-war and the post-Cold War settlement of borders, etc., and something fundamental issues there. Russia also very concerned about security for different reasons. It's a pared down power that used to be an empire of sorts, or at least a large power, pared down to a smaller size, and insecure about its nature, its status, its role. It's you know, is it a regional power? Is it a global power? How does it has all kinds of security challenges around it of various types, which everybody would agree are security challenges, like the Islamic issue, terrorist threats. Others which only Russia might consider to be security issues, like the fear of loss of its near neighborhood to the west, and NATO, which it sees as a security challenge and has made quite clear. So that's one where the mutual interests, there's a mutual interest in security, but it was never brought into the partnership. And I think this is kind of a fundamental problem, combined with the fact that it's a contiguous area and that there's a shared neighborhood, which poses part of that security dilemma, at least for Russia. So security, and of course, Vadim, I guess it was Arkady who mentioned the overtures on the part of Russia that there should be a common European security framework, and the rejection of that notion in favor of the continuance of the transatlantic NATO alliance. Now, I'm not trying to lay blame here. I'm just saying that there's a problem there. If you're thinking of a strategic partnership that's purely or primarily based on economics, where the value issue is problematic, it's two different definitions of the Europeanness, where they both seem to matter a lot to each partner, that they have the right to define what that means. And thirdly, another fundamental issue, security, is not addressed. I think that makes room for the possibility of trouble. And that therefore one might interpret that at least part of the reason for the shift in the Russian position is reactive, not simply a response to domestic political factors. If that's true, then it requires a deeper reflection on what the nature of any restored partnership might be, at least in addressing that security issue. Now, I know that's very problematic. I have really only one optimistic suggestion, which is that I think it would be a good idea to think about, sort of Arkady's suggestion that maybe strategic partnership still can be kept in the vocabulary as a long-term concept, but to think about what that might look like, given everything that's happened. What could, maybe not a strategic partnership, but at least some kind of, modus vivendi, reasonable one, that would have elements of partnership. What could it look like? What would we want the relationship with Russia to look like 10, 15 years from now, if we ever can get past this current crisis? Would it look, it'd have to look quite different than what the nature of that partnership that Vadim described, or the pre-existing one that Arkady talked about. And it would have to, I think, take account of these differences. And my suggestion would be to maybe suspend on the EU's part, thinking about Russia as a European country. I know that sounds offensive in one way, because it is. But to suspend the notion that Europe can define what that means for Russia in any case, and treat it more like China is being treated, one could say. Of course, we had a critique of that this morning, so maybe that raises a whole other set of issue. But to start thinking about it as a country that isn't necessarily to be treated within the European framework. It's to be treated as a country that is, quite, in many ways, quite different, although contiguous with the EU. And that might offer the way forward. And if you see a destination, perhaps then you can find a road to get there.
So, Merje Kuus, who's Professor of Geography at University of British Columbia and has written on geopolitics and expertise, a very good book about European diplomacy. I would recommend it to you. Merje.
Thank you. My comments will, in a way, add some, like Joan's, add some footnotes to the presentations. The presentations were so rich, and I'll try to highlight 3 points that might help us understand the divergence between EU and Russia. All of those 3 points have to do with intra-EU dynamics of decision-making, the dynamics within the European Union among the member states. The first point has to do with different agendas inside the EU. A strategic partnership with the EU is a bilateral relationship with a multilateral actor. So, of course, there are always different agendas on everything in the EU. With Russia, I would argue that those differences are deeper, they are more entrenched, and they are more visible at the level of even everyday sort of technocratic policymaking. Of course, any relationship with European Union, there is never one telephone number, it's always a conference call. So to understand EU's relationship with Russia in particular, one really has to pay attention to who's on the other end of the conference call. Too often the tendency is either to discount the real differences within EU among the member states and just talk about the EU as if EU was a unified actor. Second tendency is to sort of bemoan the lack of consensus and wish that that difference would go away. And I think that's also short-sighted, because if that difference was to go away magically and EU magically would act with as one unified actor, that decision would need to override somebody inside the European Union. So in that sense, that disagreement, I think it's here to stay, and it might be a good thing, because whatever the decision then emerges does have to take on board views from different countries. The second issue around intra-EU decision-making that I'd like to highlight here concerns, and that's very much dovetails with Joan's points, it has to do with identity. Relations with Russia are such an integral part of Europe's vision of itself. And so therefore, I think that the relations with Russia differ from relations with Brazil, China, or any other country, because even with the United States, you can talk about the West and Western values with the United States, but with Russia, you deal with Europe. And that question, where is Europe's border, where does Europe end as a cultural area? And because of that dimension of identity, again, the disagreements are not sort of icing on the cake, but they go much. They are such a substance of the cake itself, EU decision-making, questions of identity. What is Europe? The tendency there also has been either to say, foreign policy is about interest, not about identity. Let's not talk about identity. And I think it's short-sighted, because it will fester. Or secondly, it's been a tendency to sort of, again, wish that identity politics went away. And I think with Russia, it will not go away. It sort of will be there. And the question is, how do we integrate the identity politics into some kind of reasonable civil decision-making within the European Union? So perhaps here I'd like to also add to sort of Daniel Hamilton's point earlier that we need to think, I think, in terms of strategic partnerships, we need to think about societies and not just states, and especially with Russia. The third point, very briefly, has to do with the creation of the European External Action Service. And I would argue that service is very important as a continuous venue of coordination of positions, a sort of institution where the member states have to and can discuss those different agendas in a sort of formalized, institutionalized manner. There is a tendency, in my view, especially in the grey literature and in journalistic accounts, to see coordination as a kind of nuisance. It slows things down. EU is bureaucratic, it's too slow. And I think that's unhelpful. It's more useful to think about coordination not as something that prevents the EU from acting, but rather as something that enables the EU to act. Coordination with other EU countries also enables the big countries to act. So the question then is not simply, what does the EU want, or what does Berlin, Paris, London want, but also we need to be much more sensitive to the different agendas in smaller capitals, including domestic political shifts and domestic elections in some of the smaller countries, and look at much more how those different agendas get filtered through the Brussels machinery, and pay, I would argue, much more attention to Brussels in addition to the member states. Just two more points. So my comments here too, alongside David's earlier point, I would argue it's not useful to try to reduce complexity. Complexity is there to stay, and I think we need to really tackle that complexity rather than try to streamline it. And the final point, Arkady's presentation very much made me think of contingency. That the story you told is a sad story, but it's a story of contingency. History is not preordained. Things can look up, they can look down. Well, they can look up again. So perhaps I can end on that note of contingency. Thank you.
Okay, so questions, please. We have a little bit of time. Have we stunned everybody into silence? Nobody wants to talk about Ukraine even. You have a question here. Good. Yes.
It's a question to Arkady. Okay, thank you very much for your really refreshing and enlightening presentation. I think you will not get a space in the Canadian media, but you could be a really valuable contributor to, I think, academia, which cherish intellectual integrity. So it's difficult to disagree with all your points. My question regarding major underlying cause of this confrontation or clash between now Europe and Russia. So, but one major cause. So in my view, it's a view on sovereignty, because Russian position is, this is my sovereignty, and you have your oath. Okay. In European Union, they are going through the period of kind of diluted sovereignty, where some countries transfer economic sovereignty to bigger countries, political sovereignty to smaller. So what would be major course in your view?
Yep. Manfred.
Can't refrain from making at least a short comment. In the whole structure of the Union now, between member states and the Union itself. So thanks, Merje, for pointing out the value in coordination. I think that it goes slightly further than that, what we do in the External Action Service. I think we actually also put on paper proposals and strategies certainly mandated by our political masters in the Council and in the European Council, but it's also a bit of a driving force beyond coordination. Having said that, it also is true, obviously, that in the CFSP, in the European Common Foreign and Security Policy, we still work on the principle of unanimity. That's true, but we achieve it. And what we achieve is not necessarily always a very small common denominator. I think that that Ukraine is a case here where we demonstrated that against quite a lot of expectations from around the world, where they say, it's never going to work, and the EU is, maybe they come up with some joint position, but that is going to falter and break apart. And fingers crossed, but I have the feeling that's not the case, and we've proven people wrong. And that is an achievement that I just like to highlight here.
One more question there, and then, okay. We'll take the three, and then we'll go to the next two after that.
So if the fundamental fracture flaw flowed from the values not actually being shared, or a divergence in the values shortly after the partnership was launched, what does that tell us about the potential for China and India? Or is it, as our chair would suggest, that the same expectation of alignment, convergence of values isn't present in those agreements, and that's not a necessary element of the strategic partnership.
Okay, why don't I give the panelists an opportunity to respond if they wish?
Couple of things. It's really difficult for me to single out one thing, which would be a primary cause of everything, but I don't think it's sovereignty. Because when Russia stated its case in about 2006, that it does not really want the West in general and the EU in particular to continue the policy of democracy promotion inside Russia, because Russia viewed it as basically interference into its domestic affairs. That request was accommodated. The EU stopped anything remotely resembling the policy of democracy promotion. They were funding some organizations and maybe some people, but it was not about changing the nature of the emerging political system in Russia anymore. That happened, I would say, about 2006. Because at that moment, there were two basically, I mean, they were not colliding, these two discourses. They were always trying to see what is more important, the interests or the values. So the EU was always saying that we have to care not only about the values, but about the pragmatic interests. And about 2006, this idea of pragmatic interests took prevalence. So it was not about sovereignty. So what it was, rivalry in the common neighborhood. So when Joan was saying that domestic factors is part of the explanation, yes, and Russian reaction to some other things, to the Western policies, is also part of the explanation. It's also true. 2004, it's not accidental that I have my kind of periodization. My periodization has 2004 as a turning point. 2004 is the year of the EU enlargement, to include the former Eastern Europe. And not only as far as the internal nitty-gritty of the EU politics are concerned. It matters more that since that moment on, the European Union received a common border with the post-Soviet space. I mean, it has included the Baltic states, but what matters more was that it received the border with first Ukraine and Belarus and then Moldova. And that European Union could not disengage from that area any longer, because it understands that if it wants to have a secure eastern periphery, it needs change in Ukraine. It needs change in Belarus. It needs these countries to adopt European norms to a large extent, more than Russia itself. And this is not acceptable for people in Moscow, because people in Moscow understand that if that's going to happen, this part of the post-Soviet imperium will be lost. And 2004 was also a very interesting year, because that's the year when a lot of things happened coincidentally, but nevertheless happened in the neighborhood. The primary thing is the Ukrainian Orange Revolution. But there was also a constitutional referendum in Belarus, which was ran under the slogan of full sovereignty. There were things happening in Moldova when the Cossack Memorandum was rejected. It's a long story. But the Ukrainian Orange Revolution was the most important thing, because Russia diagnosed the Ukrainian Orange Revolution as a Western conspiracy. Who were the front figures of the negotiations? Solana and Kwasniewski. And the Russian representative, he was invited, but he didn't really play any role. He was invited to be an observer who later stamped the deal, but he was not negotiating it. So the idea was that EU was really willing not to play by the rules. There was a number of reminders. The most important, strangely enough, it's a forgotten one. It's the statement of Mr. Medvedev in the immediate aftermath of the Russian-Georgian conflict. So it's August 2008, when he stated in a televised interview that Russia wants to have a privileged zone of interests. It was this statement was played down after that, but it's never been denied, and it's never been recalled. So this remains a part of Russian official foreign policy doctrine as concerns the neighborhood. So Russia cannot give up, as I wrote in some of my publications, that for the European Union has a number of neighborhoods, and it's always playing with trying to find this balance between the southern and the eastern neighborhood. And for Russia, there is only one, the neighborhood. It's this neighborhood. So when the EU comes and intervenes, as Russia sees it, when it proselytizes on Russian canonical territory, Russia cannot accept it. And the EU cannot stop doing it. So, because this is a different EU, because it is the EU which understands that in order to guarantee its interests, this periphery has to change. This is irreconcilable. But if we had progress in other areas, especially the convergence of economic rules, I believe, I'm not certain, but at least I'm inclined to think that maybe managing the differences in the neighborhood would be easier. But when you're dealing with the situation, when you don't have a progress on any other item of the list, then what divides you tends to dominate the agenda, and you cannot do anything about it.
Vadim, do you want to respond to anything from the floor or from the discussants?
Maybe a short remark concerning the Ukraine crisis. Of course, this is the main subject, main issue of our relation, but from my point of view, it should not be the number one in our agenda, because it's obvious that we could not reach agreement on all points, and we face with a number of difficulties, a number of obstacles, which is quite difficult to overcome, and European Union and Russia as well. That is why we should put on the first point other issue, which more important and which could be discussable, and where we can reach such a certain agreement.
Okay.
First of all,
just
it's
very
economic.
quickly, because we okay, sure.
Just one point. You notice in Vadim's list that there was no common space on the common neighborhood, and that, you know, was the actual issue, and it goes back to security, which is the other thing I was talking about. There's a good reason it wasn't on the list, because it was first Russia rejected being part of the European neighborhood policy, and therefore wasn't part of the Eastern Partnership policy, and the EU was reluctant to include Russia in a negotiation over their heads, or seemingly, you know, bypassing those countries themselves. I mean, to negotiate the future of those countries with Russia would seem very antithetical to European values. And probably maybe Russia wouldn't have wanted to either, for different reasons. But I mean, that just shows the problem. It was the area that was not in the structure, and there was no way within that relationship to deal with that issue. And that's a big red flag. And just one other comment, you know, in response to Arkady's idea, well, maybe if things had gone well in other areas, it would have been fine. And I elaborate on this in an article that's coming out soon in a book, but the argument is that it's not, I agree with Arkady that the export of democratic values was muted by the EU. But what wasn't muted and couldn't be was the export of regulatory and economic norms. And you know, the idea that if you're going to trade with the EU, your goods have to meet some kind of norms. There have to be the regulatory aspect, and that's a very important part of the association agreements and of any trade agreement as well. Maybe not total convergence, but at least some kind of mutual recognition or some kinds of compatibilities. That became increasingly irritating to Russia, that export of norms. And the list that Arkady had with the Gazprom, you know, the commission charges of price setting and the third energy package are indicative of that. So the one area I can see where they could have made work improvement could have come was on visa-free travel. Whether that would have been enough to change the atmosphere, I don't know. But I think the EU there could have been movement on that one.
Very quickly, we've got
On something different, I mean, what Joan said, that maybe you should start thinking about Russia as China. It's tempting, but I mean, first, in order to achieve that, Russia would first need to get a GDP to China's size. But I mean, if that happened, I can only imagine what kind of panic we would be now having in Europe. It would be a completely different ball game. We would be seeing remilitarization of Europe rather than the partnership talk.
Okay, so if they're still interested in asking, the 1, 2, and a third, yes, question or not? No? Okay, so 2 then. Jacob first and then Robert.
I'm Bob Haig. I'd like to ask Moshe a question along the lines of if Hitler had never been born, would there have been a Second World War? How much does Putin play in this? I mean, if Putin wasn't around, would things have been different, or was it inevitable that what you've outlined was going to take place no matter who was leading Russia?
And Jacob, if we can keep it relatively short. Question?
Can we think that when EU considers its relationship with Russia, somewhere there is the point that comes up, and that is when the chips are down, Russia, which is Eurasia physically, geophysically speaking, will opt for Europe rather than for China. And the second one, very, very briefly, there's been a lot of intellectual activism in Russia, the Dugin theories and so on. I wonder if the panelists, the entire group, would care to comment on this and about SCO and the CICA, that the EU must develop some kind of an attitude or approach towards. Thank you.
Okay. What is SCO?
SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, CICA, that China is going to be the chair of until 2017 now.
Responses? Who wants to take that first? Right. Right.
Okay. Well, there was a specific question to Arkady. Why don't you go first? No.
This, I mean...
That's a response, I think.
No. I mean, what I'm trying to say is... depends on where you draw the line if Putin had not been there. There is a difference. I mean, for me, who started my life as a Marxist and then it was converted into realism, and then which are the same thing, and then realized that actually it doesn't work. Because, yes, people's individual views matter a lot. So had Putin not come to power in 1999, yes, I do believe the situation could have developed differently. But had Putin not returned to power in 2012, no, I don't think. I've already mentioned Medvedev. I mean, the details would be different, but the thinking in the elites has been there at least since 2003. And that's when for the first time, this idea that the unipolar moment is over, that the end of the Cold War can be replayed, that the West is now weak, that the West got stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's not going to get what it wants to get. I mean, these ideas gradually started to become very powerful very quickly after 2003. So 2003-04, I'd say after that, the details could have been different, but the thinking of the elites by that time was already consolidated. On Russia and kind of Eurasia and China, well, look, I've been doing research on Russia-China relations. I've interviewed people in Moscow, I've interviewed people in China. We finished that study 3 years back, or 4 already now. My views have only kind of got firmer since that time. Russia is becoming a junior partner of China. I mean, just not to go too far, let me quote, there is an interview, a huge interview today in Kommersant by a person who is responsible for the Russian defense export. The title of the interview, Mr. Isaikin, the title of the interview is, "When we are working in the interests of the Chinese People's Republic, at the same time we are also working in our own interests." I mean, if you asked me this question yesterday, I would not have answered the way I'm answering now. It is there. The idea is that China is the partner, and the junior partnership with China is preferable to this type of relationship with Europe. It's very powerful. So 5 years ago, there was this idea that the rise of China will be pushing Russia closer towards Europe. No, Russia is pivoting to Asia in its own way. It's selling energy to China in order to strengthen the relationship. in a deal which is essentially a loss-making deal economically. But it's going to be there because it's geopolitically important. So.
But then you're implying that the average Russian person would feel culturally, historically closer to China than to Europe.
No, I'm not implying that. But junior partnership does not necessarily mean that. If you travel to Moscow, you will see more Chinese than you think. The Chinese are not in the Far East because they go where the money goes. And the money is in Moscow. So the China businesses are in Moscow. But Moscow is a big city, so 200,000 Chinese is not a problem in Moscow. You don't see them there. So I'm not implying anything cultural, but I'd say that the Russian foreign policy at the moment does not really depend that much on what a man in the street in Irkutsk may think.
Okay. Marie?
Very briefly. Regarding Dugin, geographers who's a writer of geopolitics in Russia, geographers have written quite a bit on Dugin. This is a resuscitation or rejuvenation of mid-20th century geopolitics. In that sense, Dugin is a mirror image of some of the other right-wing geopolitical theories that have come out in neocon circles in the United States, in some other right-wing circles in various other places. So I think it should be treated as such, as a particular latching onto as a mid-20th century geopolitics. Regarding Europe, that question of identity, in a way, Joan put it nicely. I think Europe, it might be useful for Europe to relax its hold or grip on the idea of Europe, and not to let it go. Of course, European Union is in Europe, but maybe let there be some possibility that European Union is not all there is to Europe, and I think that would just relax things a bit. It would be useful.
Vadim, quickly, and that's the last comment.
Concerning Russia-Chinese relation, I think that it was a clear response to stagnation of European Union-Russia relation, and in any other sense, Russia at the moment has a European vector of development because it is much more important for Russia. It's my personal point of view, and when the condition will be created for the resumption of EU-Russia relation, it will be done. Because China is a important partner, but it's not the main partner of Russia.
Dugin should not be overestimated, his influence. I mean, Dugin, last spring, when Ukraine was only started, he thought that he was more important than he actually was. And 3 months into his campaign, he was fired from his position in the Moscow State University, and nobody kind of rose up to defend him, because he started saying things which the Russian government was not ready to support. So he has his intellectual freedom, but it's no longer supported at the top level. Okay, he's read more in the West than he is in Russia, frankly.
Okay, people, that's the end of the session. 15 minutes late. I'd like you to join me in thanking the participants, please, very much.